Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome, another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. It's good to have you with us today. So here we are in Canada in the throes of a trade war, for all intents and purposes, with the United States, a tariff war, more specifically, I suppose. Prime Minister Carney, of course, just a couple of days ago was down in Washington, seemed to get along fine with Donald Trump. We've talked about that and analyzed that, as have just about everybody else, too. But the one common thing that we heard in the discussions between the Prime Minister and the Premiers, and just as you and I as ordinary citizens, is this is time for Canada to stand together. We have to show a united front that we are strong, elbows up and all these sorts of things. Well, in the midst of all that is Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who raised the idea in the last couple of days of a referendum in Alberta to separate from Canada. That's, somewhat contrary to this let's all get together and stay together and be strong together, right? And there's a number of different things to unpack here, but what Smith is doing and maybe why she's doing it too. First and foremost, I guess we can get into the fact that Alberta and the federal government have had an acrimonious relationship for years, not just since Danielle Smith has been in office, but there's always been a feeling by many Albertans that Alberta in particular always gets a raw deal from the federal government. But is that a reason to separate? I mean, if you don't think you're getting a very strong deal from the federal government, you complain about this. And at one time or another, Alberta certainly, Newfoundland, Quebec certainly, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, they've all had some disagreements and some problems with the federal relationship. But if you're pissed off at the federal government, hey, the line forms to the right. Or I guess in Danielle Smith's case, the extreme right. But you sit down and you talk about your differences and you try to find some common ground and some resolutions to it. Why all of a sudden are we talking about separation? Well, we can speculate about that, but it's interesting to note, and I think to put this in the context, Danielle Smith, of course, after making this announcement, was appearing on a number of different talk shows on CTV and on CBC, the political shows, and basically said that she doesn't want a referendum. She doesn't want Alberta to separate. She wants to bring the temperature down with the talk about going on, the separation that's going on there. Well, Premier, I would simply ask you, if you're trying to bring the temperature down, then why did you pass this legislation for this referendum and to basically to make it easier for what's going to be happening here? Here's the bill that they passed, and I think it speaks volumes about where her mindset is on this. This bill, which would change citizen-initiated referendum rules to require a petition signed by only 10% of the eligible voters. Previous general election, that's down from 20%, by the way, with the regulations that were in place. They'd have 120 days to get these signatures as opposed to 90 days in the previous situation. And basically what this legislation has done is making it much easier for this to happen. And Smith looks at that and says, okay, I'm really trying to bring the temperature down. It seems that, what have I said on this podcast so many times before? Don't just listen to what they say, watch what they do. She's basically throwing gasoline on the house here and giving somebody matches and then say, well, I didn't start the fire. That's exactly what's going on here. But she doesn't want to be the one who's going to be pegged and say, well, this is all your fault. But she's certainly feeding this. And she's saying, well, constituents' voices have to be heard. There are always going to be dissenting voices. Surveys that have been done in Alberta recently have suggested that there could be upwards of 30% of the people in that province that would like to separate from Canada. Some even become part of the United States. Watch what you wish for. But I don't know that number's been too much higher, too much lower in the past. There always seems to be this anger towards Ottawa from, many of the Western provinces. And by the way, let's put this in context. Not without reason. I mean, there's a very strong argument to be made that, the federal government, not just Justin Trudeau, but other governments previous to that, including Stephen Harper, by the way, have been less than favorable towards the prairie provinces. And they're pretty ticked off about that. And I get that. But what you're supposed to do in situations like this is work it out. You're supposed to have federal and provincial conferences. You're supposed to meet with the premiers on a regular basis and talk about your disagreements. And that hasn't happened. First of all, Trudeau just didn't seem amenable to doing that sort of thing. Stephen Harper never had any meetings at all. I think he had one in 10 years with the premiers. So to suggest that there was a lack of communication there, I think is a massive understatement. So what bothers me, and I think what bothers an awful lot of Canadians, is that Premier Smith is basically feeding off that anger and that acrimonious feeling that people feel for, well, what some people might say, political expediency. What do I mean by that? Well, things are not going well for the premier in her home province these days, and even on a national level, I suppose. Her government is in the throes of what I guess for all intents and purposes, a controversy there. It has to do with a healthcare situation where she basically fired the CEO of the Alberta Health Group, Althenia Medzeropoulos, who, by the way, she had hired initially. And the reason for the firing, it appears as if it was because the recently hired CEO for Alberta Health Services launched an internal investigation into whether or not the government, Smith's government, had interfered with healthcare contract procurements to favor certain private companies. They smelled a rat. They wanted to explore it. And before she could even get the investigation off, Premier Smith fired her. And now there's a lot of legalities involved in this right now. Apparently, a wrongful dismissal suit, but also some concerns by the opposition parties in the Alberta legislature to say, yeah, okay, that's fine. Let's deal with the wrongful dismissal suit, which is probably going to cost the province a ton of money. But what about that investigation about favoritism within procurement of contracts? Where's the investigation into that? Well, it doesn't seem to be anywhere. So there's that, all right? And the people of Alberta are getting a little ticked off with what's going on there. And the idea, once again, that favoritism and people getting money that maybe didn't even deserve it or qualify for it is something that needs to be investigated by any government. That's certainly happening there, too. The other element, too, has to do with, well, the recent political climate here. We know, of course, Danielle Smith is the Alberta Premier who toddled off down to Mar-a-Lago to go and talk to Donald Trump. You've all seen the pictures of him smiling with the handshake, and Kevin O'Leary's in the picture, too. Seems to think he's some sort of an ambassador. I don't know if he's an ambassador for Trump or whatever. But anyway, be that as it might, she attended the inauguration, we're told, as a guest of the Trump family. And so trying to get cozy. Now, the accusation, of course, is that she was doing all this to try to curry favor with the Trump administration. Hey, Mr. President, you really don't want to put those tariffs on Alberta oil, do you? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. That hasn't changed a whole lot of anything. But there's some concern there that she was trying to basically do a one-off here. In other words, instead of being strong as a unit, the Canadian premiers and the federal government, she's off doing her own bidding. And I think that upset an awful lot of the premiers. I know it did, as a matter of fact, and certainly an awful lot of Canadians, because there's an argument to be made that if that's what she's doing, she's really undermining the efforts of what Mark Carney and others are trying to do right now to try to find some solutions to this tariff problem, which I find fascinating, simply because, she speaks one thing and then goes and talks about another, saying that she wants to have a united Canada. She wants Alberta to stay within the Confederation and maintain their sovereignty. Well, so does every other province. And that's what the negotiations are supposed to be for. And you really wonder just what her long-term goal is and just what the motivation is for this. So she's got some other problems right now. And we both know that one of the easiest tricks that politicians can play is when the heat's on at home, you play the art of deflection. In other words, forget about the healthcare crisis. Forget about, the concerns that she's trying to cozy up to the Trump administration. Let's change the channel. Let's get people thinking about something else. So all of a sudden, this idea of referendum and trying to appease the folks that want to separate in Alberta, however small those numbers might be, is changing the channel. And that's the story now. They're not talking about the other things that are dogging her administration right now. They're talking about this. And that's why she's obviously, I guess, successful to a certain extent, because she has basically had people change their focus as to what's going on here. I don't know that it's going to be effective in the long term, but at least in the short term, it seemed to have happened. So there's that element to it. The other element to this, of course, is if this is successful, and she's gone out of her way with this legislation that they passed to make it easy, much easier for some of these disgruntled people to get their number of signatures and start this. And she says that if they are successful, and if there is a petition that's signed that meets the qualifications, it could well be a question that goes on the ballot in next year's election. There's going to be an election. I wonder if that's part of the motivation here, too, that she's trying to curry favor and basically try to boost her approval ratings within the province of Alberta by appeasing to this group. And again, it wouldn't be at all surprising to know that Danielle Smith is trying to appease to the extreme right. That's where she lives. Pierre Poilievre, by the way, did the same thing in the last federal election, figuring that's my base and I've got to appeal to them. How'd that work out for him? in the federal election. The fact of the matter is that base is always going to be there. And to gain success in politics and hopefully to do the best possible things for your constituents, you've got to broaden that base and you've got to listen to every voice, not just the ones that are on the extremes. And I don't know if Danielle Smith is capable of doing that or she even wants to in situations like that. But that's the situation. There's a political reasoning for this. But if it should go further, and there's a pretty good chance that it might, that this petition will go forward and it's going to be presented to the legislature, we go into a whole different situation now. And for those of us that remember the referenda in Quebec, there have been, two major ones, of course, about separation. And they survived, and Canada survived those. But it's not easy, because we heard those simple arguments that, okay, we're going to leave. We want to be a sovereign country or a sovereign nation, or we want to be part of the states. And it raises all sorts of questions about what could be happening here. A good deal of the land in Alberta, by the way, is Crown land. In other words, it belongs to the federal government, not to the province of Alberta. And I mean, if you want to play hardball with somebody who wants to separate, you could simply say, that's our land. So go ahead if you really want to separate, and if that's what the people of Alberta want. But what they may find is that their Alberta that they wanted to separate with is a lot smaller than they think it is, because those federal lands would not be going with them. What about currency? What about health care payments, transfer payments, equalization payments, all these other sorts of things? Are they getting a good deal on this? They don't think so. But you get no deal if you bow out of Confederation. It's a very, very long, complicated process. And on top of that is of course, the reaction from Indigenous groups, basically who sent a letter. The three main Indigenous groups sent a letter. They all signed it to the Premier saying, that's not your land. A lot of the land in Alberta also is treaty land, and it belongs to these Aboriginal groups. And that was signed with the Crown, not with the province of Alberta. All those deals happened, all those treaties were signed long before Alberta became a province. And they're saying, Danielle Smith, you have no right. That's not your land to give away or to take with you. So it's a quagmire here of political footsteps going way, way deeper into problem areas that I don't think anybody really wants to do. So, and I don't know that she cares about that. I don't know the other people do either. You know, the old idea about watch what you wish for, Albertans, if you decide to vote for separation. There's a whole series of things here that have to be taken into consideration. You know, you talked about currency. I mean, all the same things that applied to the Quebec separation arguments years ago now apply to this. Now, I like to think it's never going to get that far that it's going to be a problem. But what we want to do is have the people of Alberta remember that, look, there's hope here. I get it that they didn't like Justin Trudeau. I was not a fan of Justin Trudeau. And there's a long line of people that are like that too. But he's gone. He's gone. There's a new guy there. And the indications that we have are that he's got a pretty good handle on what's going on. Mark Carney has promised, by the way, that he's going to be meeting with the premiers. He's already had a couple of conversations with them, virtual conversations anyway, and he's talked to Danielle Smith on more than one occasion and said, let's talk about what your concerns are here. So it seems to me, at least at this stage, that you've got a prime minister there that's saying, okay, forget about what happened. That wasn't me. That was the other guy. Let's talk about this, and let's see if we can find some solutions to some of these concerns and some of these differences. So, and she said that's great. She as she mentioned on one of the programs the other day, encouraged by Prime Minister Carney's meeting with the President of the United States, and also with some of the things that he said in these meetings with the premiers. Well, if you are pleased with the potential here for some progress and for some commonality here, why in God's name do you bring up this idea of separation now? The timing stinks. And again, it goes back, I guess, to political opportunism on her part that I think in this case supersedes what is best for Albertans, certainly, and what's best for the country. I'm reminded as I go through some of these issues and some of the things that she seems to be saying these days of an old quote from American author Robert Heinlein, who says, you can sway 1,000 men by appealing to their prejudices a lot quicker than you convince just one man by logic. In other words, it's easier to build on hate than it is to build consensus. People are angry, stoke that fire and say that I'm going to be your champion, you angry people. That doesn't get anybody anywhere. But she seems to be playing that game. And it's a game that could lead to disastrous results. I don't just mean for the rest of the country, but I'm talking about for the people of Alberta too. So think about this. And to the people of Alberta, just think about what kind of quote-unquote leadership you're getting from your premier right now. And ask yourself, it's really in the best interests of people in that province and certainly for the province's long-term economic viability. More to come on this, of course, as we see how this unfolds in the days and weeks ahead. That's it for this edition of the podcast. You can catch us, of course, on Substack, Spotify, Apple, certainly on YouTube, Blue Sky, and so many other platforms. Great to get your feedback on this, especially on a subject like this that is so important, as we're at a pivotal point in Canada's history right now. As the Prime Minister has said so many times, we're stronger together than we are separate, and we have to keep that in mind, and that's to everybody's benefit. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the production of the podcast. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.